Afternoon all, I hope you're all well. So this is a bit of a clip in regards to the introduction of biomechanics, but also kind of looking at the factors that are involved in biomechanics. People use the term or look at the term biomechanics and are generally quite frightened by it, but the use of biomechanics is generally everywhere in terms of sports performance and every other attribute surrounding it. So today we're going to look at a paper and kind of make some connections and make some links into a particular sport, and particularly how it's of key value that we can look at and use different measurements of performance and assess and analyze different metrics of these variables that can impact performance. So today we're going to look at a tennis serve. So a tennis serve is a very complex skill in itself. There are a lot of segments to the movement. There's a lot of factors that can impact the success of the movement. So we're going to look at all these different attributes and see how they in particularly differ from elite athletes to amateur athletes, because 0.01 of a second can actually impact the final output of the movement. So the key thing we need to look at for a tennis serve is, what do we want in a tennis serve? So that really stems into the attributes of the sport itself. So when we're providing a biomechanical analysis of a sport, of a movement, we really need to kind of look at the actual movement itself and how that really links into performance. So the use of a tennis serve really is to initiate starting a match. And obviously in a starting a match can obviously have an impact on points, sets, and overall the outcome of the match. So a tennis serve is a key value for a tennis athlete in general. So when it looks at a tennis serve, we may look at placement, we may look at power, we may look at spin, we may look at, there's so many attributes to consider in the tennis serve. So this is obviously just an example with tennis in general. At the end, at some point, what I'd like you to do is pick your own sport, provide a bit of an indication about what the sport is, pick a movement, and then really look at how, or in particular, what factors impact this movement. So anyway, enough of me blabbing on, let's look at the tennis. So quite an old paper, say old, 6 years old. So the key things that we look at is assessment of competitive level on efficiency and injury risks. So the key thing that these guys are looking at is a kinetic analysis of the upper limb. So the upper limb is obviously your shoulder, your elbow, your forearm, the key attributes that you would involve in tennis. So the review of literature, we're not going to look at the review of literature. Obviously, I presume it's varied in terms of the fact that the risk factors that impact a tennis serve. So obviously, the key thing with a tennis serve as well, it is overuse. So even these guys highlight it is an overuse injury. The main reason it's an overuse is because you're completely, you're repetitively using it in a game situation. Obviously, a tennis serve, you are serving in a match repetitively, whereas team sports such as basketball, football, even though you are repeating these movements, they're varied in terms of time. So with a tennis serve, that you may be serving within 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Whereas in a basketball game, you might take a jump shot one every 6 minutes, one every 2 minutes. Again, it's more dependent on the dynamics of the match. So again, just to look at the basics of a tennis serve. So these guys obviously looking at one tennis court, looking at one player serving into obviously the service box. So they don't know tennis, this is a service box. And the key thing to kind of consider in a tennis match and the actual attributes of a tennis serve is the placement as well. So if it's a serve out wide, obviously it's going to dictate the play where there's the opponent who's going to be out wide, and then the next shot can obviously dominate the play a little bit. So this really kind of emphasizes the importance of a tennis serve in general. Obviously the power aspect of it. So when we're looking at power, when we're looking at force, you'll obviously look at the term force a lot, and you'll see that as in terms of, we measure this in newtons. So force is generally measured in newtons, and force is obviously an important thing in terms of output and how much force we put into a movement. So whether that be a squat, whether that be kind of a jump, anything kind of from an impact point of view. And obviously we know from an impact point of view there's going to be an influence in loading. So if there's an influence in loading, that is also going to have a big impact in terms of the outcome of the movement, or in this point, the outcome of the serve. So is it going to be as powerful? Is it going to be as accurately placed, etc.? So theoretically saying the quicker we produce the movement, there's a better opportunity mechanically we can provide enough force to get the ball over the net as quickly and as powerfully as possible. Another attribute and theory of looking at is if we can slow down the movement and allow some level of accuracy, we can determine where the ball is placed and located in the court. So for instance, the further it is on the service box here, the less time the player has got to react and respond. Whereas if it's around here, the midsection of the service line, then obviously the player's got longer for the ball to travel to him or her, and then obviously they've got more time to respond in the shot. So this really kind of summarizes a little bit the importance of a tennis serve and the variables that can impact a tennis serve as well. So what these guys have done is done 3D analysis, so 3D modeling. So the key thing is at some point you guys would be doing this, or hopefully will be doing this. We'll see how things pan out. But the key thing is obviously you can see kind of these markers. So these markers along here are on joint aspects of the movement. So this allows us to provide a 3D analysis of this movement itself. So look at it as a stick person. So you can see them from dot to dot, etc. So eventually it will perform a stick person where you can actually look at the angles of the movements created. And this is effectively what you will do in your second assessment. Okay, so as we go through, obviously the statistical methods gone through, but we're not going to go through that. So the key thing obviously is the basics, is a tennis serve. So these guys have really highlighted each phase of a tennis serve, and as you can see there are 5 phases that are quite complex. So all these phases are going to have a massive impact on the output and the eventual outcome of the serve. So it's important that we are efficient and also we're maximizing these movements as well. Because like we've said, if there's one aspect to the phase that is not as efficient or effective, then the output is going to be severely affected as well. So the key thing is obviously knowing different phases of the movement, and obviously different sports will have different requirements, but they'll also have different kind of phases within the movement. It's important to know obviously in terms of the literature, not every single skill is the same in terms of phases. So for instance, these guys have allocated 5 phases, whereas another piece of research may get rid of the acceleration and deacceleration phase and just look at it as winding, cocking and the follow through phase. So it's important to kind of look at that and not be fearful the fact that everyone assesses movement in a different manner. That's perfectly normal. So the key thing obviously here, they've looked at a range of like parameters. So in terms of the parameters, ideally what they would do is provide units of measurement. Obviously haven't done that, but obviously they're taking the impression that we know that we're looking at forces. So forces in general, it is a standard unit of measurement. So like we highlighted here, newtons. So the key thing in newtons really is if it is exactly what it says on the tin, is if there's a higher number, it means there is being more force produced at that movement or that phase in particular. So as you can see, there's a varied list of parameters, and the key thing for kind of this bit of literature really is not to say that this athlete performs more force in this phase or this athlete performs less force in this phase. It's really to provide advice for the coach. When we look at elite sport in general, we're going to look at sport in general. Obviously, athletes have their own different levels of technique that work for them. Cricket's a fine example of that in terms of bowling or batting, but tennis is also the same as well. So it's important to say that, even though we're highlighting a specific movement, and then we're highlighting some evidence to suggest that, some athletes may produce more force in certain phases of the movement or certain anatomical points of the movement, we're not saying that that is also correct, okay? We're just providing information, and that's the key thing when eventually you do take your exam as well, and making more of a clear link between the information is the most important thing, and what the information occurs through the feedback process is also important. But we're not saying one is right and one is wrong, okay? We're just providing information to the athlete and the coach at the same time. So as we can see, even like we highlighted, so the upper limb, obviously the shoulder, elbow, wrist. So this is really looking at basic parameters in terms of the movement itself. and they've highlighted different phases of it. I'm not going to go through every single one. The p-value, obviously this shows if there is a significant difference between the two, between the professional athlete and the advanced athlete. And only quickly scanning through, there's only one significant value between them. So that also shows that even when we look at statistics, we don't need to think that there should be a big difference between the two, because when we break down the so many variables, there might not be that much difference. Okay, so it really is important to kind of consider that as well at the same time. Some p-values are pretty close, but other factors that can impact obviously a p-value in statistics is obviously the effect size, which they've highlighted here, the amount of participants, and obviously the balance between participants, because obviously there's 11 accounted for here and 7 accounted for here. So like we've always highlighted in the past, 14, 15 participants is better because we might find better trend in the data. So we might find more of a trend between obviously professional and advanced, but because there's an imbalance between the participants, it's harder to kind of generalize and summarize. But like we've highlighted, we're just looking at the information and of key of use. So from an information point of view, what does the coach do with this? Well, they present it to the athlete and they look at the video analysis of that aspect to it, and they look at identifying areas that they feel that they might need to improve on. So if you are kind of a semi-professional or an amateur athlete, then you're looking at to kind of take the next step up to be a professional and advanced athlete at the same time. So professional is obviously looking at being an advanced athlete and etc. But like we've highlighted in the past, there's going to be a lot of factors that influence kind of movement itself, and force production, neuromuscular attributes of an athlete. That's a big variable that will have an impact on it. So like we've highlighted, this is just information, but it's what we do with this information is of key value. Further attributes as well, looking at the actual serve efficiency. Now the key thing here to highlight is the p-value is significant. So we've highlighted here, or the research has highlighted here, that there is not really much difference between kind of the force attributes or force elements to it, but when it comes to actually further kind of detail in terms of like the ball velocity, so this is another performance outcome, then we can see there's a significant difference between the two athletes, and that alone may categorize a difference between professional athlete and an advanced athlete. But again, like I've highlighted, so many factors can impact the data. So key thing for the professional athlete is obviously how they are going to influence and increase certain aspects in terms of force production in certain areas. So you can see differences throughout. Even though they might be represented quite small, they're obviously of significant value, and the statistics kind of highlights that at the same time. So yeah, just to summarize, even though this is looking at a tennis serve, the key thing for it is, I know you look at different words and you think, oh my God, I don't really know what they mean. But you research them, you go away, you look at them into more detail and then kind of highlight what they mean. When you're reading a paper, you're not kind of looking to understand everything, but you're looking to get out what you kind of want from it. So the key thing may be, what's the difference between an professional athlete and an advanced athlete? Is there any statistical differences? Yes, there are. So these are the attributes that they need to work on. And those are the kind of the minor details, the difference between, a good athlete and obviously an advanced elite athlete at the same time. So key thing, just to summarize quickly, biomechanics, application to sport, looking at different movements, looking at different factors that impact movement, looking at actual different anatomical attributes that impact the movement, and really linking into performance outcomes. So always remember, when we are looking at particular sports, particular movement, what is the purpose of that movement? To identify the purpose of that movement is good, because then you can then begin to assess different attributes around it, and then to improve it. And that really is it in a nutshell. So if you can at some point, kind of summarize the importance of analyzing movement, that would be good. That would be good for you to kind of understand it. What is movement? Apply it to an example. Obviously we've used tennis here, but theoretically use something else. Football kick, I don't know, any sport that's relevant to you. Hopefully that's been worthwhile. If not, obviously please fire us questions over. Other than that, have fun. See you in a bit.